Hello. Merry Christmas, or belated Merry Christmas. I'm not quite sure when this is going up. But this week I read Essays in Love by Alain de Botton. It was a great read, by the way. I totally recommend it if you haven't checked it out yet. But reading that sent me down a lot of questions about love, connection, and validation. And I thought I'd talk through some of my thoughts on here. So I've got some notes pulled up in the background in case you find my eyes wandering here and there. But I want to start off by talking about love as validation and love as connection. Now, psychologically, this distinction shows up really clearly in attachment theory. So in simple terms, people with more anxious attachment styles tend to experience love as a form of reassurance. Love becomes proof that they're safe, wanted, and not about to be abandoned. Because when your sense of self feels unstable, like it often does in your 20s or your early teens, it makes sense that you'd look for something external to hold it in place. Being loved can feel like evidence that if someone chooses you consistently, then you must be okay, and that you must be doing something right, that you're a good person. But that kind of love isn't necessarily about the other person, it's about what they reflect back to you. Alain de Botton writes about this in Essays in Love, where he talks about how much romantic desire is narcissistic. Not in a bad way, but we want to be loved because it confirms the story that we want to believe about ourselves. Love becomes a mirror, and when the mirror cracks, so does our sense of worth. And that's where validation comes in. Validation-based love is inherently unstable because it requires constant maintenance. Every unanswered message, every shift in tone, every moment of emotional distance, it feels a lot bigger than it is. You start monitoring the relationship for signs that validation might disappear. But connection works differently. In All About Love, Bell Hooks defines love not as a feeling but as an action of care, commitment, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. And what's interesting about this definition is that it removes love from the realm of constant reassurance. Love isn't something that exists to prop up your self-esteem. It's something that exists to build understanding and mutual growth. And that kind of love doesn't feel euphoric. Sometimes it's quiet. It might feel unremarkable, which is why it's harder to crave when you're feeling lost. Validation is immediate, but connection is earned and a lot slower. And if we're getting a bit academic, Eva Luz writes about how modern love is deeply shaped by capitalism, especially the idea that being chosen is a marker of value. So in a culture where everything feels measurable, be it your success, productivity, desirability, love starts to function like a kind of social currency. Being loved becomes proof that you're competitive and that you're wanted in a marketplace. So when you want love, it's not always intimacy that you're reaching for. Sometimes it's relief, sometimes it's status, sometimes it's just the comfort of being able to say, hey, at least someone wants me. And I don't think that makes anyone shallow. In fact, I think it makes sense in a world where identity feels so unstable and constantly evaluated. But obviously, connection asks for something harder. Connection requires that you show up without performing, without trying to be impressive or perfectly curated. It means letting someone see you in moments where you don't feel confident, productive, or particularly lovable, and trusting that the relationship's not going to disappear because of that. That is why I think love as connection is a lot scarier than love as validation, because validation gives you something to hold on to, but connection asks you to let go of the idea that love is something that you earn by being good enough. And I think for me at least, the desire to be loved has often been less about wanting to share my life with someone and more about wanting someone to tell me that I'm doing okay, that my life makes sense. And realizing that doesn't necessarily solve anything, but it does change the question. Instead of asking, why do I want to be loved so badly? I try to ask, what do I expect that love to do for me? Because do I want reassurance or do I want understanding? Do I want to be chosen or do I want to be known? And I don't think those answers are fixed. I think they shift depending on what stage you are in your life. But noticing the difference feels like a very important first step, especially in a decade where it's so easy to outsource your sense of worth to someone else. And maybe the work, at least right now, is learning how to build enough internal stability that love can feel like a connection and not a lifeline. I think another reason the desire to be loved feels so intense right now is because it's become deeply performative. And when I say performative, I don't mean shallow or fake. I mean it in the sense that loving and being loved has started to feel like something that you do rather than something that happens to you. A lot of this shows up in how we present ourselves, not just online, but in real life too. You start asking questions like, am I interesting enough? Am I successful enough? Am I attractive? Am I easy to be around? And slowly, love starts to feel like something that you earn by getting those answers right. Sociologically, you could connect this back to Erving Goffman's idea of social life as performance. In the presentation of self in everyday life, he talks about how people are constantly managing impressions, whether they realize it or not. We're always on some sort of stage, adjusting how we act depending on who's watching. And when that logic enters love, intimacy can start to feel like branding. Ava Lewis writes about this in Cold Intimacies, where she describes how emotional life under capitalism becomes rationalized. We're encouraged to be self-aware, emotionally intelligent, low maintenance, ambitious but not too ambitious, vulnerable but only in ways that are attractive. And love starts becoming something that you'll audition for. And dating culture makes this even more obvious, right? So profiles, prompts, curated photos, strategic vulnerability. You're not just presenting who you are, you're presenting a version of yourself that you think will be desirable. And over time, the gap between self and performance can grow. And Alain de Botton touches on this as well when he talks about how much effort goes into being lovable rather than being known. We mistake admiration for intimacy. Being wanted for the version of yourself that's polished and impressive can feel good, but it's also precarious because maintaining that version takes work. And I think this is especially true in this stage of life, when so much of your value feels up for evaluation. Your career, your ambition, your social life, your attractiveness, your emotional maturity, you're constantly being measured, and love just becomes another space where you feel like you're being assessed. So the desire to be loved turns into the desire to be chosen over other people, to stand out, to be exceptional, to be irreplaceable. And I think part of unlearning the performative desire to be loved is recognizing when you're shaping yourself around someone else's gaze instead of your own values. When you start asking whether the version of yourself you're offering up is sustainable or if it's just strategically attractive. And again, I don't think this impulse comes from vanity. I think it comes from fear. Fear of being ordinary, fear of being replaceable, fear of not being enough in a world that constantly tells you to improve. The desire to be loved isn't a flaw, and it's not desperation. It is a psychological need shaped by attachment, by the need to belong, and by a kind of modern loneliness that exists even when we're surrounded by people. Wanting love is human. It makes sense, especially in a stage of life where so much feels uncertain and unfinished. What becomes complicated is what we expect love to do for us. When love is treated as validation, it turns into proof. Proof that we're worthy, that we're chosen, that we're doing life correctly. And when love is performative, it turns into something that we manage, something we earn by being impressive, desirable, or easy to be with. In both cases, love starts carrying weight that it was never meant to hold. It becomes responsible for stabilizing our identity, quieting our anxiety, and answering questions about our worth that we haven't answered ourselves yet. And no relationship can do that without collapsing under the pressure. Because the desire to be loved is not the problem. The problem is when love becomes a substitute for self-understanding, stability, or belonging. And these are all things that it can support, but it can never replace. And that's about it. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. I still have no idea how to end these things, so I'm sorry.